This event this morning, EOR Insights. I'm Lon Whitman, Director of EORI, and we're very pleased to have Tom Kropatsch with us this morning. EORI Insights is a quarterly public meeting platform for EORI to present project work we're on, bring in some new technologies we're testing, and to bring some industry people in to talk about important things. So I'm pleased this morning to introduce our State Oil and Gas Supervisor, Tom Kropatsch. Most of you are certainly know Tom. He's been with the Oil and Gas Commission since 2010. He's served in a variety of roles at the Commission, including Natural Resources Analyst, Natural Resources Supervisor. He was Deputy Supervisor at one point, Interim Supervisor, and since 2021, our State Oil and Gas Supervisor. During his tenure at the Oil and Gas Commission, he's been responsible for the implementation of the agency's environmental programs, such as baseline groundwater quality, remediation and disposal of exploration and production generated waste, recycling, reuse and disposal of flowback and produced water, spill and incident response, pit and seismic permitting, and the bonding program, some of your favorites. As the Natural Resources Supervisor, Tom was also the program director for the agency's Class II underground injection control program and has been leading the replacement of the agency's legacy database and development of YStar. Prior to his time with Oil and Gas Commission, Tom spent about 10 years working in the environmental consulting industry. He serves as the vice chairman currently for the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission. He's a board member for the Groundwater Protection Council. He participates as an ex officio board member of the Wyoming Energy Authority. He's a member of Wyoming's the Consensus Revenue Estimating Group, and is a registered Wyoming professional geologist. He also graduate of the Wyoming Leadership Class of 2019. So I'm pleased Tom could join us, and please welcome Tom for his little presentation.
Thank you, Lon, for the introduction. Thanks for the invitation to be here. Can everybody hear me okay? Is that okay? Appreciate, again, the opportunity to present some information, talk a little bit about the commission and industry activity, and then I wanted to talk a little bit about what the state is doing, state legislative activities, federal actions, and anything else that you might have questions or anything about when I finish with that. So just to note, that picture up there was an orphan well that we plugged last summer. That's in Clark, Wyoming, if anybody knows where those wells are at. But we inherited as orphans those wells a couple years ago and got those plugged last year, but a nice part of the state and nice place to have an oil well. So a little bit of background. I don't know that we do this too often, just a little background and introduction on the commission itself. The commission was created in 1951 by statute 30-5-101. Those statutes are known as the Conservation Act. And it was to carry out and enforce the statutes and the act. We have 5 commissioners: the governor, the state geologist, the director of Office of State Lands and Investments, and then we have 2 public at-large members who are qualified to serve the oil and gas industry. One of those being Commissioner Goolsby in the room this morning. Ken Hendricks is the other at-large commissioner right now. And then the statutes also created the position that I'm in, the State Oil and Gas Supervisor, and that was to enable the commission to carry out the duties and enforce the rules and regulations and statutes. And interestingly, also was given statutory authority to hire and employ all personnel necessary to carry out provisions of the act, but that's been kind of hijacked by processes within the state. So we always have to go through legislature and other processes to try to actually get approval to hire additional people. So it's not quite what the statutes say it is, where we would just have authority to hire the people we need. Related to that, we're currently authorized for 40 staff members. We currently have 32, and a few of those, we're down a few just because of changes in the way we do business. The online permitting system has helped us quite a bit in reducing the necessary or the need for having administrative staff that used to transcribe data off of paper and then put it into our system. So we've kind of, in the past few years, been able to recalibrate our staff and move some out of administrative duties and into more technical roles, and hopefully do our work a little better there. Our budget currently, we just started a new state budget year, July 1st. So that's the beginning of our 2-year budget that we had approved during the last budget session this last winter. We have a budget of $18.3 million for 2 years. Out of that 18.3 million, 7.5 million is dedicated to plugging orphan wells. So it's essentially writing contractors to go out and plug the well. So the agency budget itself is about $11 million for a 2-year period. A little bit about current activity out in the industry, and a lot of you probably know this better than we do, but these are some of the various data and things we look at to get an idea of how active the industry is and what's going on. This was a week ago, but the locations of rig activity in the state, there were 16 rigs according to Enverus, which is kind of we look at both Enverus and Baker Hughes rig counts to kind of see what's going on. But Enverus last week had us at 16 rigs operating. This week they say we're at 18. And so obviously, as most of you would know, the most activity in the Powder River Basin drilling horizontal wells. Last year at this time, we were probably somewhere around 20 rigs. So we're down a little bit, but we are starting to see some increases here, and hopefully that'll continue. Another thing we're looking at, and just pause for a second, make sure the online sharing is still going. Went off on my screen. This is one data point we use, wells with first production. This goes back to January 1st of 2023. And we use this to try to get an idea of the amount of wells that are being completed. Our completion reports don't always tell us exactly how many wells were completed in a given time frame, especially historical data. We might get 2 completion reports, especially on the horizontal wells. We're getting interim completion reports and then a final completion report. And historically, we never tracked a difference between the two. So if we go out just to do a count on wells that were completed based on completion reports that were submitted to the commission, we'd never, some of them we might double count, some that just had one we were accurate with. So we're starting to, one of the things we use is just the data first production of the well to understand when it was brought online. And so these are those wells from January 2023 to current. Pulled this again out of Enverus on their data that they have, just to show the locations of those. Now my pointer's not making the slides move this anymore, so should I just do it off of here? Yeah. Okay. There we go. So another one, and this one's a little bit of a busy slide here, but these are spud notices that we receive per month and then by year. And so you can see the yellow, I think it's maybe brownish yellow up there. That was 2019. So that was our most recent, kind of our highest spud count in most recent time. And then you can see the COVID years, the blue and the gray lines. Thanks, Sean. The lighter blue at the bottom and the gray, you can see that, we started that first, the light blue is 2020, and you can see we kind of started off all right. And when COVID hit, we almost went to 0 essentially on spud counts. And then the gray 2021 started pretty low, but by the end of that year, we were starting to kind of see some more activity and recovering. The darker blue is 2023. And and that's kind of that line in the middle and pretty steady. And then, or sorry, that was 2022, and then green is 2023. I don't have 2024 up there since it's partial year, but you can see since COVID, we've been pretty steady, 2022, 2023, and then we're going to be down just a little in 2024. If we do our count through July, we have 186 spuds this year. Last year at this time, we were at 231. So we're down a little bit, which matches kind of the rig count being down maybe 5 or 6 rigs from where we were at last year. But we're still seeing good activity in that regard. This is just back to that first produced graph. You can see 2018 and 2019, we were well over 600 wells with first production in those years. And then COVID happened and it was down to about 200 wells with first production. And we're kind of slowly recovering from there. We'll look at it on this next graph, but oil production graph, this goes back to 1978. You can see last year we had recovered pretty well. Our high year was 2019, a little over 100 million barrels, I think 102 million barrels that year of oil production. And then COVID, we knocked down about 85. Last year we were back up to 97 million barrels of production for the year. So we recovered pretty quickly. If we look at this year and look at where we're at, we're about 50 million barrels. That's partial through early June numbers. June isn't complete on reporting yet, but if we continue where we're at this year, we probably will exceed 2019. We should be able to get to about 105 million barrels just based on the first five and a half months of production reporting into us the way it looks. So we'll see how that goes with rig counts going up here. Hopefully we'll continue that trend. Gas production in Wyoming is a little bit different story. You know, we had our peak around 2010. Coal bed was pretty strong then and in decline since that time. And also, especially in more recent years, just not really seeing replacement of conventional gas wells. You know, Pinedale, Jonah, those areas are kind of slow. South central part of the state around Wamsutter is kind of slow. But if we look at 2024 numbers, again, we're starting to see those level off a little bit. In fact, we're pretty much month over month, we're increasing from last year. So we might change that trend just a little bit this year. We might see a slight increase in gas production really coming out of that associated gas from the horizontal oil wells. So again, another good trend if we can continue it for the next 6 months. This data comes from Energy Information Administration. It might be kind of hard to read, but it's just state rankings of kind of where we're at. This is oil production. They rank oil production on a monthly basis. So this is April numbers. This is the last month that they had available, but it's oil production in thousands of barrels per day for April of 2024. Maybe some good news there. Wyoming moved up 1 spot this year. We're at 7th in the country. We had been at 8th for a long time. Part of that due to the little bit of growth we are seeing, and also part of it due to regulatory environments in other states, in this case, especially California. And, you know, their production is rapidly dropping every month. And so we passed California, which is a little bit surprising. They used to be, but I think they used to be up at 4th for a long time. Yep. Colorado actually has not been dropping, even though we've been generally exceeding their rig count the last year or so on kind of a monthly basis, but they still have enough activity that they're pretty steady on their production. And I should mention it, if anybody has any questions, feel free to interrupt throughout the presentation, and I'll take more questions at the end, but just feel free to jump in like John did. I'm happy to take any questions whenever. So I expect kind of to see Colorado drop because of their rig count's been quite a bit lower than what it has, what it was historically in the 2018-19 timeframe, but their production is remaining fairly steady there as far as I can tell. Obviously the big ones, Texas, New Mexico, North Dakota, they're at the top. And then there's kind of everyone else there in the rest of the top 10. It's interesting, Utah with Uinta Basin is growing pretty rapidly. And other than California, everybody's kind of steady in there. This is the same numbers for gas production, but for some reason EIA does this on an annual basis and they lag behind pretty far. So these are 2022 gas production rankings for the year. They also subtract out some data that we would normally use. We just look at total gas production, and I think for 2022, we were somewhere around 1.3 TCF for production that year, and they show us just over 1 TCF for that year. So they back out probably some production of CO2 and some of those other gases that in their rankings here. But in this case, Wyoming's 9th. We are slowly dropping here, and I think some of that is, as you saw in the graph of gas production, we are declining year over year. But just with the activity in some of these other states, they're also increasing. North Dakota is right behind us, and with their activity, they're increasing in gas production. New Mexico obviously is increasing, some of those other states. So we continue to decline there. Moving a little bit into Wyoming Commission activities. This is our orphan well plugging program. These are numbers of wells plugged over the last decade. The first bar there is actually from 1997 to 2013. You can see we plugged just over 400 wells for those, roughly 15, 20 years. And then with the downturn in coal bed especially, we started to inherit a whole bunch of coal bed methane wells. And so in 2014, the legislature and the governor said to start to prioritize those and accelerate plugging of those orphan wells. So we did. Since 2014, we've averaged about 600 orphan wells plugged per year from the commission. Our high year was 2019, 2020 during the COVID downturn. We tried to keep some service industry companies going and did extra wells. So we plugged well over 1,000 wells that year. But again, averaged about 600 wells. And earlier this year, or in 2023, we had all of our orphan wells that were remaining on our list under contract to plug. Since that time this year, we did have one company go bankrupt and orphan those wells. So we have about 500 wells on our list to plug that aren't under contract. And a little more details. Yep. I'll get to that in just another slide or two. So I'll give that in a little more detail here as I move forward, and actually a little bit on this slide. So this year, 2024 year to date, at this time, we've plugged 303 orphan wells, and we have about 300 remaining under contract to be plugged. We think most likely we'll finish those up this year or maybe very early next year. At the current time, all of those wells are contracted to be plugged using a grant from the Department of Interior. As part of the what do they call it? The investment, the IIJA, it's Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which was part of a COVID or post-COVID stimulus program. They put $4 billion nationally into, and that's billion with a B, into plugging orphan wells nationwide. Most of that money is available to the states to go plug orphan wells in the states. The initial grant, well, there's 3 programs for the states. They call them the initial grant, the formula grant, and then there's performance grants. So in the initial grants, the states were eligible for up to $25 million to go plug orphan wells. It was kind of a stimulus program. They wanted to keep people in jobs. It was supposed to be presented out to the states in a quick manner following COVID to try to keep people working. And as a lot of other programs with the government, it took a long time to get out there. So it didn't really get out to the states till 2023. And so we received a grant of $25 million from the Department of Interior to plug state and fee orphan wells. And so we had contracted 1,300 wells to plug with that $25 million. And we're also doing some other associated work, closing some CBM reservoirs, doing some reclamation work, and so on, reclaiming sites. But and so that was the 300 wells we have left to plug as part of that grant. Since that, prior to that grant, all of the funding came from 2 sources of money. The first was forfeited bonds. So we have an idle well bonding program. Operators in Wyoming currently have 2 options to post bond. They can post an operator blanket bond of $100,000. And then that covers all their wells unless they're idle. And if they're idle and they have no plans to either get them back on production or to plug them, then we also ask for an idle well bond, which is at $10 per foot. And so if a company goes bankrupt or if they're in violation of certain commission rules or state statutes, the commission can declare those wells orphan and forfeit those bonds. So that historically has provided about 2/3 of the cost to plug orphan wells. And then the other 1/3 of the cost comes from industry. And it's a tax, the conservation tax that industry pays on the sales of oil and gas to the commission. Funds commission activities, it funds our budget. The $18 million budget that we had is funded by that conservation tax. It also funds the $7.5 million of that budget that plugs the orphan well. So the commission, in relation to its budget, receives no general tax fund dollars from the state of Wyoming. It's all from industry, either taxes or fees. So we have fees, as you guys know, on APDs and some other things. Some other applications, and then the conservation tax. So we've always been, I think, proud to be able to say when we go to meetings that the industry in Wyoming has covered, those costs and has stepped up to pay for the plugging of those orphan wells, and that taxpayers haven't had to do that. It's not the case in other states, and in other states that in some cases they've had no funding available to plug those until the DOI grants have come around. Since 2010, going back to that graph, we've plugged about 6,000 orphan wells. And as I mentioned, 500 left on our list to plug. Legislature and some of the things they've been doing related to oil and gas. Last year, the 2024 budget session, so that was this year, February of this year. They really only had one bill that was really active related to oil and gas. It was the pore space amendments, pore space unitization related to carbon capture and sequestration for the Class 6 program. And as you may know, the commission, the Wyoming DEQ actually has the Class 6 primacy from EPA, so they permit the Class 6 injection wells, but the Oil and Gas Commission unitizes the pore space. And very similar to the process to unitize for secondary or enhanced recovery unit. It gives access to the Class 6 operator to the pore space, which is owned by the surface owner in the state of Wyoming. And so they originally passed some of those statutes to detail that in 2007, 8, 9 timeframe. And now that those programs have started to attract attention and become active in Wyoming, last year the legislature went back and made some amendments to some parts of the statutes that were really complicated and not clear on what their real intention was, especially related to economic benefits to the pore space owner. And so they made some amendments to that. They also looked at a couple enhanced oil recovery bills, but due to the budget session, those didn't make it through. One of them failed introduction, which during a budget session for any non-budget bill, there's a heightened level of requirements to get introduced. And so neither of those made it through introduction. This year, the 2024 Minerals Committee, so now we're in the interim session for the legislature, where their committees meet as joint committees on the House and Senate side and look at various legislation that they might sponsor for the next session, which would start in January of 25. We asked for one bill to make some amendments to the commission statutes. That would be the produced water storage reservoirs. Our current statute does not allow us to permit centralized reservoirs related to any kind of reservoirs or pits or anything like that. With the additional water reuse from industry with it, especially in the Powder River Basin for the horizontal drilling, it really makes it complicated to not be able to do a centralized produced water reservoir for water reuse. And so we asked them to relax those restrictions a little bit so that we could permit centralized reservoirs there. And at the last meeting here in Casper, at the end of July, they approved to sponsor that and move that legislation through to the session. So the Minerals Committee will sponsor that in the next session. We're also looking at oil and gas bonding. That really started as a response to the federal rulemaking on bonding, their leasing processes and leasing rule that they did. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides. So I'll leave the bonding part and what they're doing to that slide. And then they also voted to move forward both of those enhanced oil recovery initiatives into the session. So there's one bill that they'll look at. as people who are involved in this, there's a 45Q tax credit for CO2 sources related to capturing in CO2 for storage or reuse. That if you inject that into a Class 6 well, there's a $85 a ton tax credit that the sources can take. If you put it into an enhanced oil recovery project, there's a $60 tax credit you can take. So one of those incentives would try to even out that tax credit for the CO2 sources so that there isn't a disadvantage to operators who want to buy that CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, because the source can get a bigger tax credit if they actually just sequester it instead of using it for EOR. So the state's looking at a severance tax incentive that would potentially go back to the source to try to even out that tax credit. And then they're looking at a second bill that would just give a severance tax break to the EOR operator for any incremental production based off of an EOR project. So a little more straightforward of just a 3% severance tax break on any enhanced oil recovery project, or the oil produced through those projects. So we'll see if those get through, but the Minerals Committee has sponsored that. Commission action. Yesterday, we had our August commission hearing, and we heard the first pore space unitization application in the state. It was from a company called Frontier Carbon Solutions, who is looking to store carbon in the Rock Springs uplift area, so around the Trona mines in the Rock Springs area. And the very good application from Frontier. The commission listened to that and took it under advisement. So they didn't vote yet on whether or not to approve it. We continued it to the October hearing, and so they'll make a decision at that hearing and ask for some additional information from the applicant, especially as it relates to the economic benefits that they provide to the pore space owners on the injection. And so we'll hear a little more information, and at the October hearing, the commission will likely make a decision on that. Late 2023, the commission had a hearing related to forced pooling, or what I'm terming up here is statutory pooling. Based on that hearing, one of the mineral owners who was forced pooled or pooled into those wells sued the commission in two courts, one here in Casper for a review of the decision to determine if the commission made the appropriate decision on that pooling, but then one in Laramie County to look at constitutionality of forced pooling or statutory pooling altogether, and whether or not the statutes are unconstitutional. And as all of you know, that forced pooling process has been a standard oil and gas industry process for many decades. It's been on the books in Wyoming since the Conservation Act started in 1951, and it's been modified probably about a dozen times, or maybe not quite that many over the years. But some of the allegations made in that lawsuit were that it was a new stimulus process that the legislature started after COVID to try to get more oil and gas wells drilled in the state. Some various other issues stated it hadn't ever been, for the first time ever, the legislature modified the statutes to the Conservation Act. So there's some allegations in there that just aren't accurate, but we're responding to that in Laramie County. So we'll see how that goes. We're pretty early on. Our responses were due in middle of July, and then the applicant's responses we just received recently. So it's progressing, and we'll see where that goes. We're also working, as most of you probably know, on WISTAR, which it stands for Wyoming Statewide Tracking and Reporting. It uses a risk-based data management system application. If you guys are actively drilling, you already know we have the eForm system that does APDs, spud notifications, BOP test notifications, so on. We're nearing implementation of our next rollout of the next applications, where we'll take electronic directional survey data. And so once we have that, we'll ask for all operators, anybody who's drilling a well, to submit their directional survey data electronically, so we can just plot that right on the map. So instead of doing a straight line between the surface hole and bottom hole location, we'll actually plot the well track and be able to show that on our maps that we present out to the public and to industry. And so that's obviously a public facing and external application. The UIC permitting and tracking Most of that is internal that we do to track data and essentially report back to EPA on the activities that we have to report to them in the Class 2 program. But for those of you who do have a Class 2 disposal well and you fill out the monthly Form 16s, which essentially track your volumes that you inject into those wells, there will be a form that you can put that data into in the future and submit it electronically, much easier instead of having to do it on paper. And currently in development is our completion reports and an electronic payment system. So you can pay your fees using a credit card if you'd like to do that, instead of having to submit a check separately from your drilling permit, for example. You can just submit the permit and a payment for that permit right on the same system. So those will be, they're in development now that have to go through testing. And so they'll be the next things out, but it'll be probably end of this year or early next year before we get those implemented. The UIC permitting side of it will really speed up our internal process. The reporting to EPA can take us, just to count all the data, we report twice a year, and they have 4 different forms you got to fill out data on. And it might take us almost a week to calculate all that data and get it into EPA. So being able to just enter it when we get it and into the system, and we'll be able to hit a button, the forms will spit out the data that EPA needs and we can submit it. So it'll really speed that up for us. And it's, yep. Other states use portions of it. Since we're the most recent one to develop that, ours is going to be kind of the most advanced at the time. Other states do have some older systems that we were able to take some of the data from or some of the processes from and update them. So I'll show you a screenshot of it here in a minute, but it'll really, the goal is once we finish all of the applications, that industry will actually be able to just submit their UIC permit to us online. And then we'd go through the hearing and have all that data automatically entered and just be able to collect all that without having to, do any other data entry there. It'll just come through the application process. One of the systems I listed there, and if you may be using it, but if not, it really is a good tool to search data. This is our Data Explorer system. You can see there on the left-hand side, you can search, or maybe you can't read it, but you can search by about anything you'd want to search by. It really is a little more advanced than our legacy website for searching data if you're trying to find wells, and then it links you back into the legacy website if you need to look at production or some other data that's in our old system. So this really, if any of you have ever tried to search by a well name in our legacy website to find a list of 100 of them come up because they all have the same start of their well name, or maybe none of them come up because you didn't, it just wasn't a good search functionality. This, you can type in partials, you can type in a partial API number, you can do any of that stuff and it'll come up with any well that had those attributes within it. So it really is an easy system to find the data and then still get back into our old system. So this is YStar. If any of you are using the rig schedule notification form right now, this looks pretty familiar to you. What this does shows bringing on the directional survey, the UIC permits, and our Form 16 for the monthly disposal well. This is some screenshots from the UIC permit. So you can see we'll be able to track formations, or what we're calling zones in here. So injection zones and confining units and other UIC data, track well data, and it all links together. So as you start to enter this data, it just starts pulling information in from the other parts of the database. This, as I mentioned initially, that'll all be internal to the agency to track our data. Then as we develop our hearing module where we'll be able to take applications online for hearings, then we'll bring that up to the public. This is the directional survey form. This is if you were to try to enter it manually by hand, a directional survey, but we'll be able to take an electronic deliverable where you can just, from your directional survey company, just get a spreadsheet that will provide an Excel spreadsheet that you can just upload here. So you really won't have to manually ever enter this, but this is the screen that collects the data we need. If you were to enter this manually, this will be public facing for industry. So your company can see your data and enter your data in this system. Moving on quickly through some of the federal actions. There's been a lot of them, as you all know, in the last couple of years, and especially most recently here in 2023 to try to get out a lot of federal rulemaking before potentially the election and a change in administration. So BLM did several rules, ones we've been watching and commenting on, the fluid mineral leasing and leasing processes. There's a lot of bad things in that rule, but one of the worst is the bonding. And I'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute. Waste prevention and production subject to royalty, that's really just a venting and flaring elimination rule. Very similar to what the Obama administration did back in, I think it was initially in 2016, that got overturned by Judge Skavdal here in Casper, or eventually got overturned through a kind of a winding process there. And they're back with the very similar rule that the state did join North Dakota in a lawsuit on that rule. So hopefully we'll get this one overturned as well. It really becomes a Clean Air Act and air quality rule that BLM has no authority to deal with. It's all that should be EPA's authority. And that was one of the reasons Judge Skavdal overturned the previous one. So hopefully this one will have the same outcome. And then conservation and landscape health, that's the, call it the conservation rule, where they've elevated leasing for conservation of lands up to the same level as leasing for oil and gas or other types of activities. And so someone can nominate a parcel and take out a lease just for conservation and essentially let it sit there and eliminate any other activity on those lands. And so the state of Wyoming has also joined Utah on a lawsuit on that bill. So that progresses. That was fairly recent. EPA has also done some rules, or quite a few rules related to methane emissions. The greenhouse gas reporting rule, the commission, these are starting to get a little bit out of our realm of authority there and into DEQ as an air quality agency, but we did comment and submit comments to EPA on methane emissions and the methane fee, or the methane waste emissions charges, as that rule is termed. We did not submit comments on the greenhouse gas reporting because at the same time BLM had some comments due and we were focused on those. But essentially what these all do, methane emissions would require operators to essentially replace all of their methane emitting equipment on a location. So if you have a pneumatic valve that emits methane, you'd have to replace all those, tank thief hatches, various other things that have methane emissions. You'd have to do monitoring on all those. That methane emission rule goes as far as, if you're going to plug a well, you have to notify EPA of your well closure activity 60 days before you plan to plug the well. You also would have to notify EPA of your well closure plan 30 days after the well goes idle, essentially. So many parts of the rule that aren't in EPA's authority. I don't know where they think they have authority to require an operator to plug an oil and gas well, or notify them of the plugging and the procedures and the schedule and the financial assurance you have to plug a well, but it's in the rule. So if you haven't taken a look at some of those, you enjoy reading the 3,000 pages of those rules. But essentially the one of them is not final yet as far as I know, and that's what I have it here as methane fees, but it's really called a waste emission charge. And that comes out of the Inflation Reduction Act, where Congress required EPA to set a fee on emissions over a certain volume. And so if you're an operator that has emissions over 25,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent per year, you will now be paying a fee on those emissions over that rate. It starts at 2024 emissions start at $900 a ton. And by 2026 and beyond, it's up to $1,500 a ton. So it's a significant dollar amount for some operators. And even if you're a smaller operator, you could trigger those levels. And that's all based on that greenhouse gas reporting rule, which calculates how much emissions you have. And then if you have certain emissions there, then the waste emissions charge rule kicks in. That's not final yet. I went and looked again yesterday to see, because I hadn't seen that it was final. We did submit comments on it, but I didn't notice the final rule being posted yet. So we'll see where that goes. But the IRA does require the charge to be in place in 2024. So we'll see if EPA gets it done in time to do that. One bit of good news, I think, on the federal side, if there is any here, the bottom thing there, the Energy Permitting Report Act of 2024, that's a Senator Manchin and Barrasso bill. There's a lot of news out now of permitting reform within not just the oil and gas industry, but all federal permits, renewables, everything. Everything has has a difficult time getting permits through the federal government. So they have a reform bill to try to help ease the permitting process. And there really is some good things in there for oil and gas, surprisingly, if it makes it through, especially on a fee-fed scenario that some of you may be familiar with, but essentially eliminating BLM APDs potentially in that type of scenario. So you wouldn't have to deal with those issues at all. And we'll see where it goes. I think there's enough desire on the renewable side that maybe some of the oil and gas stuff is able to make it through as well. So quickly to touch on that bonding rule and just to hopefully make some people aware if they haven't followed that. It's the fluid mineral leases and leasing process is the actual title of the rule, but and it does some, like I said, it does some put some very onerous requirements on leasing, and it's the bill that increased the federal royalty rate on new leases that you may have heard of. It created a charge to nominate leases for leasing, those kind of things, but it also increased the federal bonding rate from on a lease bond or a statewide bond. It eliminates an operator's ability to post a nationwide bond, so you only have the option to do lease bonds or statewide bonds in the future. A lease bond is increased to $150,000. So I think you're going from 25,000 currently to 150,000. And a statewide bond is now going to be 500,000. And so if you have federal wells on more than 3 leases, now you're going to have to post a statewide bond essentially of $500,000. And if you have that in multiple states, you have to post that for every state. And so even just one well on one federal lease, now your bond is $150,000. And so when that came out, we obviously submitted comments. Industry has sued the BLM over that rule. I'm not, at this time, I don't think the state has joined any lawsuits there, but I would imagine we're looking at that. But what we are doing is working with the state legislature to try to figure out a solution for operators that would not just put a whole bunch of people out of business. I mean, if you look at we just did a quick look at Wyoming operators, and there's well over 100 operators where the new bond exceeds their annual gross revenue. And so, I don't know how they're going to come up with the money to post that bond. So we're working with the Minerals Committee at the October meeting. We're going to have a bill in front of them to sponsor that we think would help industry. It'll be a voluntary process, and I'll provide just a few details. It's still not final yet, but essentially it would provide the commission the authority to do 2 things. The preferred alternative would be to contract with a bonding company that would be able to issue surety bonds to operators in the state. It would be backed by 2 different accounts or 2 different funds. The first fund would be thought of as a whole life insurance for a well. And so an operator would work with the company that we contract with to determine what the plugging costs of the well would be. And over time, you'd pay into that fund to fund the plugging of those wells. And then that fund would be backed by something similar to the conservation tax, where industry would pay a fee, and that would be able to back those well bonds. And essentially what we'd be able to do with the backing there would eliminate the high rate on a surety bond that you have to pay now. If you're a small company, not only do you pay a high rate for the bond, but you also have to pay, in most cases, 100% collateral on the bond. We think the collateral, we could eliminate that altogether because the state through that funding would be able to back those bonds. And then we think we could get a preferred rate on the surety, on just the annual fee or a monthly fee on the surety itself. And again, it'd be 100% voluntary. It would be funding from the industry, so no state funding going into it. And so we'll have more detail in October and encourage everybody to take a look at that. PAW is involved, so if you're a member of PAW they have details there, but we think it would be able to provide industry the time needed to get the bonding in place. And it started as a federal program, obviously in response to the federal rulemaking. But in looking at the process and in talking to companies that we've been dealing with to try to figure out a program here, we think it could just be applicable to every type of bond. So if you have bonds with the commission or bonds with state lands and investments, this process would work. You could opt into it if you would like to, and you could use that process to post bond for all of the agencies that require it, not just the federal bonding, and hopefully be beneficial there, reduce costs for everyone involved associated with the bonds that are necessary. And I think that was everything I wanted to talk about. I might have gone just a little over time, Lon, but I'm happy to take. I think we got some time for questions. So if anybody has any other questions on any of that, or just anything else that you're wondering about the commission or what we're doing, or anything else there, Bob.
On some of your early slides with price completion, how many of those were horizontal versus?
Good question. I didn't look at that, but most of those are horizontal. I mean, the conventional, there are a few still being drilled, and let me go back to the map here. If you look at the 3 wells, you know, in southern and western Wyoming, those are obviously, well, one of those is drilling conventional gas wells. The one in Pinedale, obviously directional gas, and then one is drilling horizontal in the Wamsutter area, the Crowheart stuff. That's operations that are down there. So you can see pretty much everything in the Powder is horizontal drilling. You know, those may take a little bit longer per well to drill, but generally most rigs are targeting horizontal activities. Andy.
So sounds like you said our giant orphan well list is down to 500 wells or something, right?
That's, yep, roughly. Yeah, we were down to 0 for, well, we had everything that was under contract to be plugged, getting us down to 0 essentially in 2023. But then a company called Powder River Battalion had about 500 coal bed methane wells. We did forfeit a little over $1 million or $1.5 million roughly in bonds to cover those. And so we should have generally most of the funding to plug those from bonds. And so we'll be putting those out to bid as we kind of work through our process. We have a show cause scheduled for equipment abandonment on those, and then we'll start doing the bidding process to plug those and hopefully have those done in the next year or so. John.
Who oversees the plugging of those wells for those turnkey?
The way we work those is put out a bid. Generally, we still provide oversight. Right now, we have an inspector in Buffalo, and then one out of Casper, since we're pretty active right now. But for like those 500, our inspector out of Buffalo, Lance, would provide oversight. The way we work our bids is we put out a procedure for every single well in the package, and so we ask for a bid following that actual procedure. And then we'll allow out of scope costs to be billed at T&M. And so our inspector will agree with, you know, they'll work with the contractor who has a job to determine what was off scope or out of scope from what the bid was, and allow T&M material. So in your bids, you would give us essentially kind of a turnkey cost to do the plugging if it went, you know, just without any issues. And that's kind of how we structure the bid request. And then you'd also provide T&M costs of the equipment list we have in the bid. If we go out of scope, then you would charge those rates. And so we're kind of a blend of turnkey versus a T&M type bid. They're all CBM. Yep. We have a few others, you know, that we had roughly 500 from that company. We have a few others here and there. There's a few conventional wells that are out there as well still to do.
You have an estimate of how many federal wells are still out there?
There are a few federal wells that are, I believe, in the process of being plugged by the BLM using the DOI grant funding right now. They will tell you that's all of them, but as you know, the federal process is slightly different than the state process. The way the BLM does their orphan well program is they'll forfeit a bond. If the company has a bond, they'll forfeit it. They'll evaluate the wells that are there to plug and try to decide if the bond is enough money to plug the wells or not. If they feel like the bond will cover the plugging of the wells, they'll put them out to bid and have them plugged. If they feel like the bond is not enough to plug the wells, then they'll go back to record title owners and operating rights holders and tell them they have to plug it instead. And that's generally their process. Most of the time, I don't think the bond has been enough to cover their plugging, so they just go to record title owners and tell them go plug the wells that they were on title, had the title on. So there have been roughly, that I'm aware of, about 150 wells probably in the state that the federal government has made it all the way through that process and determined were actually orphaned. They didn't have enough bond, or they didn't have any more record title owners to be able to go back to. The state assisted in plugging about 100 of those. We actually contracted the work for them because of they didn't have time to do it and still keep the money in their budget. So they gave us a grant. This was back starting in 2018. They gave us a grant to go do it. We got the work contracted. They did the field oversight, and then we paid the contractors and got reimbursed through the grant. Now that they have the DOI orphan well money, that they're just kind of handling it all on their own. But I think they recently contracted about 35 orphan wells to plug using that funding, roughly on the number of wells there. Anything else? Well, thanks everyone, I guess, for your time then this morning. Appreciate you showing up, and feel free, put my contact info back up. If you think of anything else or just want to have a discussion about commission activities or issues, I'm always at work, so give me a call. I'm willing to talk about any issues you got.
Thank you.
Thanks.